G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at chip usage and strategy with the remaining races on the F1 calendar, best times to use the chips and who they apply to. So if you're enjoying the content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. So as you can see on the screen here, we've got the first chip, Limitless. As with every chip throughout the course of this video, we're going to look at the what, i.e. what the chip actually does, how it's best used, when to use it, i.e. the optimal time or times to activate those chips, and the who. So which drivers do these chips, or teams in that case, best apply to. So first cab off the rank, Limitless. In my opinion, the strongest, the most powerful chip in the game. It has the ability to modify your entire team for 1 week only. You have no cost cap constraints. So as you can see here at the bottom, it applies to the strongest drivers and constructors on the grid. Essentially, given that points are the name of the game, the best time to maximize its usage is on a sprint weekend. That's when the point ceilings for every driver and every constructor are naturally going to be higher because we've got more points available on offer in the sprint race, as well as obviously the points we get in qualifying and on the Sunday. So the goal here is to pretty much pile it all in on the top 4 teams: Red Bull, Aston Martin, Ferrari, Mercedes. I think there are going to be certain circumstances where maybe getting drivers and constructors from those 4 teams are not optimal, but based on what we've seen so far, it's pretty apparent to me that double Aston Martin, double Red Bull, and maybe a driver from Ferrari or Mercedes would be the best combination. Given that a lot of teams right now are tripled up on Aston Martin and Red Bull, maybe it's not worth using it just yet, only because as we move through the season, there are going to be more upgrades to teams, more variables, and we're already seeing Ferrari and Mercedes at different points throughout the last couple of races close the gap slightly to Red Bull. Max and Perez are obviously in a class of their own, but I think as the season progresses and there's more developments made to each of the other cars further down the order, that we will see the gap close naturally. But I still think, as has been the case this season and the last few seasons, there's a very big gulf between the top 3 or 4 teams and the rest of the field. So I definitely think that no matter when you choose to activate Limitless, that those sprint weekends we've got remaining in the calendar are going to be the best time to do that. The next chip I want to look at is the extra DRS Boost. That was previously called the Turbo Driver, or Mega Driver should I say. In 2022, you get a 3 times point multiplier to whoever you put this on. So whether it's Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, whoever you want it to be, whatever they score that week, you get 3 times their points. If they DNF and they end up with a -20, you get -60. It is worth noting that it cannot be the same as your DRS Boost, so you can't essentially quintuple your points just if you went on Max for both. You would have to put the triple on Max and the double on Perez, or the triple on Alonso and the double on Leclerc. However you want to do it, that's how it works. So that's, I guess, as you can see here, another time, much like the Limitless, to use it is the sprint race weekends. However, what we've seen so far through the first few races and how the point scoring has been weighted in 2023 is that, particularly for Red Bull, given they're in the fastest car, when Verstappen and Perez have started further back on the grid and they've made up positions over the course of the race and those overtakes as well, they're pretty much doubling the amount of points that they would otherwise get on a normal race weekend if they would have finished first or second. So we saw Max just last weekend in Miami. He started 9th. He made a number of overtakes. He won the race, obviously. And then you throw in the driver of the day and the fastest lap. Driver of the day, if you're coming from 7, 8, 9 positions back from the start of the grid, making it up to the front, winning the race, I'd say in most cases you're going to win that driver of the day award. So that's an extra 10 points in your pocket. If we do see later in the season Max does take a grid penalty and he is up to his 3rd power unit of 4 that all drivers can take throughout the season, that might be a great time to use it on him. The ideal scenario, and I'm crossing my fingers that we do get this at some point, is where Max takes a grid penalty on a sprint weekend. So he's obviously capitalizing on the extra points you get on the sprint weekend, and then you take a penalty on the actual race day. Let's say he starts in 10th or 15th, then he banks all of those extra overtake points on the Sunday as well. So you're pretty much double or triple dipping your points there. So I think for something like this, it's a wait and see what happens, and I would expect that it's probably a chip for me that I'll be waiting a little later in the season to use. But obviously, we've got 4 or 5 more sprint races remaining on the calendar, so plenty of time to think about how best to use it. But as you can see here at the bottom, as I pointed out, Verstappen, the best driver to use it on, Perez not far behind. But I think, Max is not at all willing to get Checo within a sniff of him. He's obviously, Perez had a great start to the season so far, but I think Max is a class above anyone else on the grid. So he's my favourite for the extra DRS boost. As I said, whenever that is, we'll find out. The next chip is the autopilot chip. So somewhat similar to your DRS boost in a sense that it doubles your points for the driver that it's assigned to that weekend. However, unlike your extra DRS boost or your DRS boost, it's assigned to your highest scoring driver and not the driver that you choose to put it on. So let's say, for instance, Perez scores 30 points, Alonso scores 25, and Max scores 20. And you would be someone that puts the DRS boost on Max every single weekend. However, Perez scores 30, so as a result of him being the highest scoring driver in your team, the autopilot automatically defers that 2 times the multiplier to Perez. So instead of Max with 20, and you would otherwise get 40 if he was your DRS, it would go straight onto Perez, 30 times 2, 60 points. So much like the last 2 chips, another I think that's quite powerful, but maybe not nearly as strong as the first 2, is the best time to use that on a sprint weekend because there is, as I said, a high upside for points. And in some cases, given these sprint weekends, there's a few more variables in the mix, a bit more risk given there's a lot more at stake on the Saturday. So you never know what could happen. I think, though, because it defers to your highest scoring driver, there may be times where you're not sure when to use it. And as I've pointed out on the screen here, you might find there's a weekend where Perez and Alonso both take grid penalties on the same weekend. And as I said, in relation to the extra DRS boost, we're seeing those guys who start further back make up those overtakes and those positions gained. So even though Max might, say, be starting first or second, we got Perez and Alonso starting at 15th. They might actually outscore Verstappen. You never know what could happen in that race. So if there's clear uncertainty about who you think will score the highest in that race, where you've got a couple of really good drivers with those grid penalties and then another really good driver closer to the front, then maybe just throw the autopilot on, see what happens. If you can time it when there's, as I said, a sprint weekend, great. If you do it when there's back at the grid penalties, great, do it then. But those 3 guys, to me, unless we see serious progress made from the Ferrari guys, the Mercedes guys, are probably my favorite candidates for the autopilot right now. The wildcard, I don't think carries nearly as much value as it has in previous seasons. A big reason for that is just because of the state of the game. It's by no means what I'd expect from a fantasy game, from a professional organisation like F1. But again, as I've said in previous videos, this is not the forum for me to just dump on the game. I think for me, as I said, because we're tripled up on Red Bull, triple Aston Martin, there just doesn't really seem to be an optimal time as of right now to use it. But for those of you that don't know what the wildcard is, it allows you unlimited changes to your team with no points penalties. So in this case, in this season, we have an opportunity to have up to 3 transfers per week with no points penalty assigned. If you make any transfers after you've used those 3, or in other weeks maybe 2, you have to take a -4 point penalty for every extra trade. So that can quickly accumulate if you're making wholesale changes to your team every week. I think right now there isn't really a great time to use it because, as I said, we all have the same team, or at least for those engaged team principals, team managers, whatever you want to call us. And so unless we see a complete overhaul in the game from F1 where they reset the prices, they somehow reset the teams, I don't really know how they do that or when they do that. But if there's some kind of major change to the game that we can't anticipate, they don't communicate, which isn't really a strong suit of F1 fantasy to begin with, then maybe the wildcard is the best time to use that. I just think because we've got 6 of our 7 slots occupied by 2 teams that are criminally undervalued, there's really no reason to go against the grain unless for whatever reason we see reliability issues creep into the Red Bulls or the Aston Martins. But as of right now, it's probably a chip I'm just going to hold for as long as I need to until there's a real reason to use it. We saw last season, and I'll get to this a little bit later in the video, that F1 fantasy, or the guys that are behind the fantasy game, made adjustments to prices, midway through the season or around the summer break. I can't recall exactly when it was last year. And there were huge price swings that were really not predicted, we couldn't really make sense of. And so maybe that's an example of if F1 suddenly overhauls the pricing structure to the game, as I said, there's no notice of it, then maybe that's a great time to use Wildcard. But it's probably the chip that I have maybe the least amount of emphasis on at the moment, just because it's so hard to predict when we'll need to make changes. But as I said, stay tuned. I'm sure if there are updates, you'll hear about them from me on Twitter. As for the no negative chip, this is one that I don't particularly like. It was at the start of the season the one I found the hardest to actually understand, but now that we've been through a few races, we've seen a few people activate it, it makes very much clear sense to me. So how it works is the minimum score for your drivers and constructors, so it can be more than one in a weekend, is 0. So let's say, for instance, Alex Albon, he's in your team. He looks great in qualifying. He's, let's say, got 5 points after qualifying on the Saturday, and then halfway through the race on the Sunday he DNFs. He ends up with a -15. If you activate the no negative before the weekend starts, whatever score below 0 Albon gets goes straight to 0. So if he ended up with, as I said, a -15, if you activate no negative, he goes to 0. The problem I have with this chip is that it is very much hard to predict when to use it, or to a certain degree anyway. You don't have any guarantees that the drivers and the constructors on your team that you use it on is actually going to work. So we've seen people already use it at street circuits to start the year off, Saudi Arabia, Baku, with mixed results. There is, as I've said, absolutely or very little basis to confidently say what's going to happen in the race. So as I've got here, the best times to use it are races with high DNF rates. Saudi Arabia was a great example of that in the second week of the season. Street circuits, obviously, because there's more risk, there are narrower straights, there are sharper turns, and particularly for rookies like De Vries and Sargent, we've seen them struggle on a number of occasions already. So I really think that combine those, if you end up with rookie drivers or inexperienced drivers in your team on a weekend when it's at a street circuit, a circuit with high DNF rates, then maybe that's a great time to use it. A wet race is also a very obvious one for me, only because when the track's wet, there's going to be more slipping and sliding, there's going to be more accidents. We've seen in the past races, in past seasons, that you'll see someone just hit a turn and just take out 3 or 4 guys in one fell swoop. So the wet race is probably the obvious one for me to use, and I'm sure we're going to get one of those throughout the season. And I mean, combine a wet race with one at a street circuit, that's really a no-brainer. I think Monaco was pretty wet last year. We saw a couple of DNFs there as well. So, that would be an optimal combination to activate the no negative. And then another thing I thought about, I've contemplated whether this is actually a better time or a time to use it, is later in the season. And what I mean by that is, as over the course of the season, we're seeing more drivers use those power units, those new power units. As I said before in relation to Max, he's already up to his 3rd power unit of the season. As soon as drivers start getting past the threshold of new power units, or working through those existing ones that they've had for maybe 3, 4, 5 races, those reliability gremlins are probably going to creep in a little bit. So I couldn't tell you when exactly those DNFs are going to happen with those reliability issues, but realistically, it's something that could well happen. And if we're at a race where it's a street circuit, Singapore, for example, comes to mind. Later in the season, it's a street circuit, and at that point, we will, as I say, might start seeing those drivers or teams experience more unreliability. So something to think about. Obviously, I've pointed that out down below as to who that could relate to, but just as I said, a chip that's very hard to premeditate when the best time is, or at least when you expect those drivers to DNF. And I think also it's kind of interesting, it's almost counterintuitive, this chip, because if you activate it, you're ultimately hoping that the driver or the teams that you've got it on DNF, because if no one else uses it, then they're going to get hit with those negative scores and you're going to get those zeros. So you're essentially making up points from your driver scoring negative points if no one else uses it at the same time. Look, I don't know what the logic was behind this chip, but I guess because the -20 is so harsh, that's why it's probably been introduced this season. Anyway, that's a chip that, as I said at the start of this section, not one I'm hugely big on at the moment. Final fix, the last of the 6 chips. This chip, I think, is a really interesting addition. Again, much like No Negative, I don't see all that much value in it, because we're seeing, and I'll get to this in a minute, just points for overtakes and positions gained, negating a lot of what the point of the game is the sport, in my opinion, is. But I'll get back to that in a minute. So what Final Fix essentially does is it allows you one trade between qualifying on the Saturday and the race on the Sunday. So for instance, as we saw in Miami, there was a good example where Stroll, a lot of people didn't really like the look of in the practice sessions prior to the Saturday. So, prior to this race, or prior to Miami, should I say, Stroll was, putting in some solid results. He was finishing in the points, with the exception of that DNF. He was getting sound results, but nothing spectacular. He arrived at Miami. What we saw in practice wasn't really that encouraging, and we saw a driver like Pierre Gasly put forward some really convincing times in that Alpine, which, to be honest, hasn't really impressed as much. But Gasly's driven really well, I think, through 5 races, and he looks at home in that car, given it's a lot more competitive than what he's had in the past. Anyway, I digress. A lot of people ended up going for Gasly, thinking that he would put in a really strong qualifying time, which he did. He made it to Q3. He was in really good shape, and he still scored really well for the weekend. I think he had 10 points in Miami. And Stroll didn't make it out of Q1. So a lot of people who went on Gasly, they were really high on him, saw him finish or qualify in, I think it was P6, P7, somewhere around there. P5 maybe? Anyway, Gasly, P5, great result for qualifying for him. But with Ferraris and Mercedes further back, objectively a stronger car in my opinion, it was only a matter of time until he'd lose positions in the race and lose points as a result of losing those positions. And you've got someone like Stroll who's qualified at P18, I think it was, and in a much stronger car than a lot of those backmarker teams that have qualified, 2, 3, 4 positions above him. And what we saw was drivers, obviously ahead of Stroll, lose those positions. He made his positions up through the race, and he'd be making points for overtakes and positions gained. And Gasly, on the other hand, was coming back down the order. I mean, he still, had a sound race, but the positions he was losing was deducting points from his total, whereas Stroll was making up those points as he made those overtakes. So I guess a great example of that would be if you have Gasly at qualifying, you switch him out for Lance Stroll, and you take Gasly's qualifying points and you take Lance Stroll's points on the Sunday. And I know I've got here budget driver, but it's really a driver that's in the same price bracket that you want to make that trade. Gasly's priced around 8 million, Stroll's 7.8 or something like that. So it's pretty much a direct swap for those two. If you think someone like, let's say, Tsunoda, who's had a pretty solid start to this season, ends up somehow qualifying in P5, he's in your team, then you take him out for someone like Joe or Albon, who might qualify in P16, much like the Gasly Stroll conundrum, and you obviously make up those points as the guys that start at the back overtake those ahead, and then as Tsunoda loses positions to those coming up from behind him, essentially offsets that. So look, I've got Albon, Tsunoda, names I've mentioned. Magnussen in Brazil last year comes to mind just because he qualified first and then lost a bunch of positions, ended up obviously DNFing that race. So I know it's a very, very much a complicated chip to wrap your head around at times, but there are going to be instances where you might have a budget or a mid-price driver qualify really well, but you expect them to lose positions on race day. So that would be the best time to activate the Final Fix. So I've got here the last, I guess on the calendar, I'll just change that. The calendar for the race, the best times to use these chips. as I said at the start of the video, nothing particularly stands out to me as must use at a certain point in time, but I've just highlighted a couple of different opportunities that we could activate these chips at those times. I know there's a lot of variables, a lot of unknowns still, but based on some initial thoughts as when I think these could work, I've just got them circled on the screen here. I haven't included Imola because how the F1 website works is somehow the most the race that is closest to this point in time is, I don't know, not included in this format. So in any event, it's not Imola going to be a race I'm going to activate a chip at anyway, because it's not a sprint weekend. And unless we suddenly hear grid penalties and all that good stuff come up, it's probably going to be one I just steer clear of. So I'll go through the calendar, and as I said, there's no one best time to use some of these chips. You'll find that there's going to be others on here that I haven't circled that you might think are better, and let me know below if you have a different view on that, because I certainly am not set on using all of these chips at these points in time, but hopefully provide you with a little bit of a guide as to when we can activate there. So I've got Monaco. That's the no negative. The reason I've got it as a no negative is because it's a street circuit. We saw last year as well, it was a wet race. So if we somehow luck out with a no negative, with a wet race at a street circuit, it could be chaos, a little bit like we saw in 2022. So I've got that for now, a potential opportunity you could activate the no negative then. The next chip I've got circled for is at Austria, the Red Bull Ring, extra DRS 3 times point multiplier. Red Bull have a really good record at this circuit in the last 5 years or so. I think they've won 3 out of the last 5 races. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure Max has bagged a couple of wins. I know Leclerc won there last year, but Verstappen has shown that he's just able to make the most of the home ground Red Bull advantage. So that could be a really good opportunity to use that. But much like the Limitless and the extra DRS, any of the sprint races we've got coming up are going to be great times to use them. You never know if Max, for whatever reason, hits his 4th or 5th, in that case, power unit, he will take a grid penalty. So if he somehow times it with the sprint weekend at Austria, then happy days. That's a chip locked in for me. I've got the autopilot at Belgium, another sprint race weekend. Again, only because I don't have any visibility over grid penalties, as I touched on before, when the best time is to use that. I just thought, let's just drop it onto a sprint race weekend sooner or later. Netherlands, we've got the Wildcard. The reason I've got it there is because it's right after this summer break. So as I said, in the Wildcard section, it could be well possible we see wholesale changes from F1 Fantasy at the midpoint of the season. I really hope it's sooner than that. I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised if we see nothing from the game throughout this season, but I just think, there's every possibility that by the midpoint of the season, we hopefully have changes from the game. And you also, after, 7-8 races between now and then, you might have strong opinions on what your team could look like. There might be upgrades that come from other teams, from your Ferraris, from your Mercedes, that would warrant inclusion for some of their drivers in your team. So just something to think about. If it's at this point in the season and we're still tripled up on Red Bull and Aston Martin, then you can forget about using the wild card and just save it for the very last race of the season if you want to have some fun with some differentials. But right now, that's kind of where I think I'd like to use it. We're already starting to see a bit of change with, the Stroll-Gasly conundrum. Some people are pivoting away from Stroll into Gasly. Budget drivers are an absolute dog's breakfast. So you never know. We might, in 7 races, 8 races time, feel like we need to make a few adjustments to our team. And then further down in Brazil, I've got the Limitless. I just thought, it'll be the last sprint race of the season. We've seen some really mixed results from some of the top teams. George Russell had his maiden win last year. Lewis had a great result the year before. So I really like the Brazil circuit, the Interlagos circuit. So you never know what could happen, but I just think the strongest teams are going to typically do quite well there. So that's why I've got it saved there. It's a couple races out from the end of the season. So again, you might want to have some fun with some differential picks as well if you've got that flexibility. And then, as I said at the very bottom, final fix, very team specific. Hard to say when the optimal time is to use that, but if we revert to what I was saying on the previous slide, it's very much going to be one of your drivers that you have that just doesn't qualify well. Sub them in for someone that you think is going to score points on the Sunday. So anyway, that very comprehensive video, I know. I hope I didn't lose you at any point in time, but I just wanted to, now we've got 2 weeks between Miami and Imola, strategize a little bit around when these chips could be best used. If you have any kind of differing views, opinions to the contrary on what I presented, please drop a comment below, because I know, as I said, it's all very much up in the air at the moment, but I just wanted to get some initial thoughts down on paper so at least you guys can see how my mind's working. You might want to change up your approach to some of these as well. But if you do like the video, as I said, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate you guys dropping in for a video that has taken a little bit of time to put together. But all the best of luck in the next race at Imola, and I'm sure I'll see you guys very soon.